Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We are very pleased to start. I apologize for the short delay. We have technical issues, of course. That's always the best way to start. We're all in our office in separate rooms, so we're gonna close the door in all the different rooms and make sure that we don't have an echo. So, dear colleagues and friends, honored guests, I am Carice Witte, and I am the Executive Director of Signal, and I would like to welcome all of you to the 5th Annual Conference on Israel's China Policy. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, also to commemorate Signal's 10th anniversary. 10 years ago, Signal held the first geopolitical symposium on China-Israel relations, and I'm particularly glad on this 10th anniversary that one of the outstanding Chinese experts on U.S.-China relations who joined us back in September 2011 is with us today. A decade ago, very little was happening between our two countries. In the subsequent years, relations grew significantly on almost every front, from academic exchange and cooperation to scientific collaboration and joint research, from business investment to infrastructure development. However, Israel's policy on China has been slow to adapt to the changing landscape, in no small part due to the limited capacity across all sectors regarding China expertise. In general, there's a tendency to deal with China as we do with the US and Europe. But our relations with those regions is based on such a different history. We might take for granted Israel's skill and ability regarding cultivating ties with Europe and the US, but our connection to those countries is based on an anomaly. There are Jews and Israelis living there in the millions, and many born in America and Europe whose home is Israel. Clearly, this is not the case with China. The phenomena of low China capacity isn't limited to Israel. In fact, it's common across the Middle East, but also in many countries around the world, making these proceedings relevant for almost every country experiencing China's growing presence. Given the sharp growth in Israel's connections to China, 5 years ago, Signal began this annual conference to contribute to the discussion, looking at the best approach for keeping up with the fast-paced developments between Israel and China. The theme of this conference has adapted to the deepening tensions between China and the US, a subject that is impacting Israel in some cases on a day-to-day basis. As a result, more and more Israelis consider it important to learn about China, both for Israel's long-term successful relations with China, but also, and perhaps more significantly, for Israel's ongoing close ties with the US. In other words, a smart China policy will help Israel build long-term successful relations with China, but will also clarify for the US that Israel takes its security concerns into consideration. But none of this is easy. As an American and an Israeli who spent a lot of time studying and working in China, I can testify that it isn't simple to bridge the gaps among these three cultures. This annual conference is one small step in the process. Since we last gathered for this event in November 2019, the novel coronavirus has upended so many things we took for granted. In the midst of the overwhelming challenges presented by the effects of the virus, the China-US tensions are playing out on a variety of fronts. Additionally, we're holding this conference on the cusp between two US administrations, the past and the new one coming in. While it's widely expected that President-elect Biden will adjust the US approach to foreign affairs in general, and to China in particular, to be more consistent, adhering to traditional norms of foreign policy, including participation in international institutions and cooperation with traditional allies, it's also very clear that seeing China as a systemic rival will not change. This two-day conference will address the US-China relationship and its impact on Israel from different angles. We'll start by hearing from leading experts from China, the US, and an Israeli expert on Israel's security interests discussing the current situation and what effects this rivalry might have on Israel in the medium term. With experts from Japan, Singapore, and the US, we'll look at how Israel might fit into the US Indo-Pacific strategy and the D10, the new foreign policy grouping of 10 democratic countries. Tomorrow, the conference will address the implications of China's growing presence in the Middle East and whether and how the Sino-American great power competition may play out in this endlessly complex and volatile region. Considering the technology race between the two powers, proceedings will shed light on the prospects of the China-Israel Innovation Partnership. And to conclude tomorrow's discussions, we're honored to have China's former ambassador to Jordan, Ambassador Yue Xiaoyong, giving the closing keynote address. And finally, I am delighted to say that today our proceedings will end with a very special guest. It's our great pleasure and privilege to welcome the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, the Honorable David Schenker, to give the keynote remarks. On a logistical, technical note, this event is being held in a Zoom webinar format, and I've been asked to give a few tech points. Please submit your questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. When you do that, please add your name and country along with your question, and note that the chat has been disabled. The event is recorded and on record. And finally, we've asked the moderators and speakers in our sessions today and tomorrow to offer focused and succinct remarks so that we'll be able to hold a series of engaging debates within the limited time frame of a webinar conference discussion. Now, I want to thank our speakers and moderators in advance for agreeing to do this, and in some cases at very late hours of the night. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to these deliberations and your questions and comments. So without further ado, let's move on to the first session of the conference. Following U.S. elections, the U.S.-China rivalry and implications for Israel, I am very happy to hand over the reins to the outstanding scholar moderating this session, Professor Jonathan Reinhold of Bar-Ilan University. The floor is yours.
Oh, hang on, unmute. Thank you very much, Carice. It's really nice to be here, and in Einstein mode, I shall say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. So I'm going to talk briefly to give a framing and introduction to the session, and I did enjoy Carice's request for you to make focused remarks. There is obviously no translation into Hebrew for brief and focused, so we'll have to leave it in English. And so I'm going to make a short introduction, and then I'm going to explain how the discussion is going to proceed. So briefly put, the United States and China are clearly the most two powerful countries in the world. And in the last year, since the pandemic, we've seen a change in the way that the United States looks at China. There is only one subject about which Democrats and Republicans, Trump and Biden, agree on foreign policy, and that is China. And they both agree that the idea that was put forward beginning in the 1990s, that the best way to deal with China was to bring it into the international system, a liberal approach, through institutions, through trade, has failed. And there's going to have to be some kind of containment, a strategic change in the American approach. So it's against this background that we are examining this issue. There are two other points here. One is that China has become important economically in the Middle East. The Middle East is important to China because it gets 40% of its energy from the Middle East. And China's neighbors also get an even higher percentage of their energy from the Gulf, from the Middle East. So we've seen as a result of this, China greatly investing both economically and also politically in the Middle East, with bases, whether it's in Djibouti, whether it's in Guandar, whether it's part of the Russian base at Tartus in Syria. And we see interest in developing infrastructure, whether it's to build maybe a train between the middle of Israel and Eilat, or involvement in the port in Haifa. And as we know from the history of the British Empire, the building of infrastructure, the building of economic development ends up having strategic consequences. Israel is now in the crosshairs of all of this. Already 20 years ago, the United States blocked Israeli arms sales to China. And since then, Israeli arms sales to China have been very, very closely regulated. In the last year, there's been greater interest and greater concern in America about strategic civilian infrastructure in Israel and China's involvement in that. And that is an expansion of the China issue in US-Israel relations, whether we're referring to the port at Haifa or Chinese investment in strategic technologies and information in Israel. So the main issue that we're going to be dealing with is how do these things come together and how are they going to influence America, China, and Israel relations going forward? Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a moderated discussion of these issues. And each speaker is going to speak for about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to broaden out the discussion, and you can also ask questions through the questions and answers button on the Zoom webinar. And we will try and get the panelists to answer as many questions as we can. So I'm going to open up with a general question to each of our panelists. But before I do that, I'm just going to briefly introduce you to them. So beginning with our Israeli panelists, Major General Yaakov Amidror, who's a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He's a former national security advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He served for 36 years in various capacities in the IDF, including the director of the Intelligence Analysis Division, and he's the author of 3 books on intelligence and military strategy. Representing the United States, as it were, is Miss Bonnie Glaser, a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the CSIS Institute. Ms. Glaser worked for more than 3 decades on Asia-Pacific geopolitics and American policy. Prior to joining CSIS, she served as a consultant to the US government, including the Defense Department and the State Department, and she's published widely in academic and policy journals and newspapers that you might have heard of, like the New York Times. Our third panelist representing China is Professor Dai Wei, who's professor and vice president of the University of International Relations in Beijing. Before that, he worked at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations for more than 2 decades. His last position there was as director of the Institute of American Studies. And indeed, his research expertise covers issues of China-US relations and US security and foreign policy, and he's published extensively on this issue. So to each of you, my question is, how do you see the China, Israel, America triangle going forward during the Biden administration? And we'll start with, I think, Miss Bonnie Glaser representing the United States. Then we'll go to Professor Dai Wei, China, and then Major General Amidror of Israel. Miss Glaser.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel with the other distinguished guests. My expertise is more in US-China relations than it is in Israel, but I will try to draw out a few implications. My thesis is that I anticipate more continuity than change in US-China relations under the Biden administration, but there's potential for lowering tensions. I think competing without confronting and also finding areas of cooperation. Certainly approaches to allies and partners will be somewhat different, but the concerns I think will remain the same. I'm going to give 3 quick reasons for why I think that continuity will really dominate the relationship. First, the US and China have some conflicts of interest that are difficult, if not impossible, to resolve, although they can be managed. For example, China's military buildup is focused on developing capabilities that put at risk US military assets that might intervene in a crisis on China's periphery. The United States, of course, believes it must maintain access in order to defend our allies and American interests. So therefore, China's civil military fusion project is going to remain of great concern to the Biden administration. And here that may have relevance for Israel and concerns about technology being transferred to China. Secondly, the reason why there will be primarily continuity is that China's ambitions and the policies it is using to implement them are problematic. Xi Jinping's goal is to boost innovation, to make China a leading technological power, and that is being pursued in ways that threaten US interests. Another example is that Xi Jinping has called for China to lead global governance reform. So when China was simply aspired to be a participant in the international system, there was less potential for US-China confrontation. But now that China aspires to actually lead this process and inject its norms and values into the system, this is driving strategic competition. And then thirdly, China sees the global balance of power as trending in its favor and wants to exploit the opportunities. So we know in 2009, we had the global financial crisis. And this led the Chinese to see the onset of US decline. And now I think many Chinese at senior levels view the pandemic as accelerating this process. So of course, Beijing sees risks and dangers, but I think that China is keen to capitalize on the problems the US is facing, the negative reputation of democracy in some places around the world to make gains. And this will ensure that US-China strategic competition will endure. Finally, I'll just tick off a few changes that I expect to see in US policy. All agencies of the US government will be focused on reinvigorating the United States, not confronting China. And so this will mean that there will be less effort almost on a daily basis, as we've seen in the Trump administration, to put pressure on China. And that may create more space potentially for countries like Israel. Secondly, the Biden administration will definitely prioritize working with allies and partners to protect shared interests, but also to push back against some of China's policies. This will be particularly true in the Indo-Pacific, but it will also be in areas relating to technology. The US will seek to cooperate with China where interests converge, and this may be on climate change and global health, for example. That may tamp down some of the friction, but it certainly will not solve the outstanding problems that I said at the outset. And then finally, the Biden administration will definitely re-engage in multilateral institutions and seek to update them to deal with challenges that China poses. I think the World Trade Organization is probably at the top of that list. When it was created, no one envisioned that a massive state-run mercantilist economy would emerge in the global economic system. So I'll close just by saying that there is potential to stabilize the US-China relationship, at least put a floor under it, manage the competition in a way that does not produce confrontation. The Biden administration will seek to work closely with allies, I think, like Israel, not by arm twisting, but I think more by listening and perhaps by persuasion. But in order for the US-China relationship to improve, it is essential that China takes some responsibility for the downturn in that relationship. And so far, what I hear from senior Chinese officials is that the ball is in the US court. It is all the fault of the Trump administration. And if that is the approach that Beijing takes with the Biden administration, then I fear it will be difficult to make any progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Dawei, please unmute and would love.
Yes, thank you. Thank our moderator, and I would like to thank Carice and the Signal for having me today. And I think today is the it's a symbolic day for me because it's winter solstice festival in China. So tonight here in Beijing, we are in the evening. This is the longest night in the year, and the daytime will begin to increase from tomorrow. So I think this is very, it's a symbolic date, maybe for the China-US relations too. I think I almost agree with every words that Bonnie said. Um, well, I'd like to emphasize on the opportunity side. Of course, I think I don't think the bilateral relations will change fundamentally, but we do face an opportunity to stabilize the China-US relations. I think this opportunity lies in the actions of the two sides to solve some outstanding problem. Maybe from the beginning, maybe some very small, minor issues, but then some outstanding problems in the bilateral relations to rebuild the confidence. I think both China and the U.S. need confidence for a stabilized bilateral relations. And then I think we have an opportunity to reassure each other that if we have to have a strategic competition, it's a limited, it's a benign competition rather than a strategic confrontation or even a military conflict. I think let's assume that if Trump got the second term in this election, I think the China-U.S. relations will continue on current trajectory. I think it's moving from competition to confrontation and even military, even conflict. So in the year 2017, when Trump administration announced its national security strategy, I think at that time it's announced as strategic competition, but I think particularly this year, we are in a confrontation rather than competition. So the Biden, if we can grasp the opportunity of next 4 years, I mean both China and the U.S., I think maybe we can try to improve our respective domestic conditions, or maybe try to prevailing over the other side, but not destroying or weakening the other side. I think this is a healthy competition, and we can have a limited competition, which means we don't pursue a negative sum outcome. Of course, it will be good if we can have a positive sum outcome. And even it's not too bad we have a zero sum, but I think in past 4 years, we have some negative sum outcomes. And also in this kind of competition, we can cooperate in some areas that our interest overlaps. So I hope the two countries can resume their senior dialogues and made it effective and sustainable. I hope the two countries can set up or develop more crisis management measures, and the two sides can have some kinds of economic negotiation, and also the two countries have healthy and sustainable people-to-people exchanges. I think the essence here is to explore a new equilibrium between interaction and security. We need to explore the border. How far can we go with an mutually acceptable security condition or strategic condition? So for Israel, I think since the Biden administration, of course, will draw the allies closer to the U.S., I think the question is how close will Israel follow the U.S. policy, particularly in its the U.S. policy on technology and economy. how close will Israel follow that, and how hard will the U.S. press Israel to follow in its economic ties and the technological ties, and of course overall foreign policy. We hope that of course, we understand that Israel is a U.S. ally. Of course, there will be policy, very close policy coordination, but I do hope it can be the U.S. plus Israel with China. In this paradigm, we can solve or narrow our differences. But I don't want to see the U.S. plus Israel against China. That will be very harmful for China-U.S. relations and China-Israel relations. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Major General Amidrol. Please unmute.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very proud to be in this distinguished, between these distinguished people. And I think that the whole issue of Israeli-American-Chinese relations is very interesting because in a way it's symbolizing the whole relations between two superpowers in a very focusing area, which is Little Israel. Of course, it's known we have special relations with the United States of America, and we will do whatever is needed to keep these relations in the future with this administration, with the previous administration. Israel will work with the administration which was elected by the Americans. It's not our choice, but these relations are critical for Israel. At the same time, and I hope that it will not be a kind of a contradiction in the future, Israel has a very clear interest to enhance the economic relations with China, and as one who worked very hard to make the first visit of the Prime Minister in 2012, we had it in mind all the time. We want to enhance the economic relations with China, and we hope that slowly we will change even the political relations with China, and I'll speak about it later. The question in the Israeli room is very clear. How can we enhance the relations with China in spite the tension between the United States of America and China? And that will remain on the table, doesn't matter who is the administration in China. I think that the administration in Washington, I think that the notion of many Chinese that it is Trump issue, and the day that he will leave Washington, the new administration will look at the Chinese in a different way. I think it is not going to happen. As far as I understand, within the Democrats, there is a clear vision that is not so good about the attitude towards China, not so much about trade, but much more about human rights. And if you combine the two interests together, the interest of America to keep its trade benefits, and with the judgment of so many Americans, liberal Americans, about human rights in China, I think that you will not find an easier administration in Washington. Maybe less vocal, maybe more diplomatic than the previous one, but the essence of the relations will not be changed. And you have to add to what went wrong with the previous administration the issue of human rights, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, whatever. I think that when it is coming to Israel, the main concern of the Americans, and it was hinted here, that China will not bypass the American restrictions regarding technology by entering to Israel, which is a hub of innovation. And China is very aggressive in its attempt to get Israeli technology on the table, under the table, and Israel should be much more concerned about it and to prepare ourselves or to build in Israel better tools to deal with this situation. because I think it is the interest of Israel, not of the United States of America, to prevent any leak of technology, which from the Israeli point of view, this is our national asset. We are not selling anything around the world but technology. And for us, technology is the main national asset of the state of Israel and should not leak to China. And we have to do it, not connected at all to the Americans, but it will satisfy the Americans as well. I think that we cannot forget, China is not a substitute to America. America has relations with Israel relating to its economy, technology. We are fighting in the Middle East with F-35, which was provided by the Americans, financed by the Americans. In the international community, China is voting automatically against Israel, whatever is the issue. You didn't change your philosophy and attitude towards Israel since the 60s of the previous century. Totally different from the relations with the United States, with which we have an open dialogue. Even we don't agree, at least we can try to convince. In China, we don't have a chance. Nothing was changed in spite of the flourishing of the economy relations between Israel and China since the visit of the Prime Minister 8 years ago. Nothing. You vote in the United Nations and the international arena, Israel is automatically, you are on the other side. So from our point of view, the problem is how to continue and even to enhance the relations with China without losing technology that we don't want to be transferred to other countries, to continue to have the special relations with the United States of America, in spite my assessment that the tension between China and America will continue. And for that, we have to be very clear about the limitations, what can be done and what cannot be done. From the minute that we were very clear about the fact that we are not going to sell weapon systems to China, it's clear, it's not on the table anymore. When it is coming to dual-use technology, it's more complicated, but at the same time, we should be very clear what can be transferred and what not. And from time to time, we have to go to the Americans and say, yes, that's what we are selling. We don't think that it is endangering any American interest. And because we have an open dialogue with the Americans, it's easy to speak with the Americans about it. But I think that before China will change its philosophy and policy and a little bit move towards another attitude towards Israel, which today you are automatically against, I don't see any way to compromise whenever it will be American relations for Israel with Israel or Chinese relations with Israel. We will prefer the American relations. It's much more broader and deeper and than any alternative that can be offered today by China.
Thank you very much, Major General Amidrol. Okay, so now we're going to move to questions and answers, and we've been asked to keep the questions and the answers short. So I think we have one question here for Professor Dawei, and it's from Shalom Shirman, who doesn't write which country he's from, but I'm assuming it's from Israel. And he's asking you the following. What would you say to commentators who claim that Xi Jinping is more interested in confrontation in the Pacific competition with the US because it enables him to reinforce his grip on power in the Communist Party and in China more generally?
Okay, I will give a short answer to that. I think if we were him, I don't think we need that kind of confrontation. That's not in his interest, and that's not in China's interest. Because actually, if you are Chinese, you will know that our president's power is very consolidated, and he's a powerful leader, and his reputation here in the country is very high. And particularly this year, after China relatively successfully controlled the pandemic in China. I think his reputation is very, very high. So I don't think he need this kind of external confrontation for his political purpose. Rather, I will say, since China comparing with the United States, the US is a superpower. Confronting with the US will make our external environment worse. So why does he want this kind of confrontation? I don't understand this. Yeah, I don't think so. Yes.
Okay, Professor Glaser, would you like to come in on that? Do you think there's a connection between the greater assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy that we've seen in the last decade and domestic political calculations of the Chinese leaders?
Well, if you go back an entire decade, certainly domestic politics plays a factor in Chinese foreign policy. And I think particularly around China's periphery when it comes to territorial disputes, Xi Jinping has placed even greater emphasis than prior leaders on sovereignty. There have been actions taken recently over the summer. We saw against India, the first real confrontation that led to loss of life in 20 years. And we've seen continuing tensions in other places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and a significant increase in military pressure, especially against Taiwan. But these are not all explained by domestic factors in China. There's a lot of factors that are specific to each of those disputes that would explain why China has been more assertive. And I think, frankly, it is difficult to separate out all of the factors. I don't rule out that there is still a domestic factor, that Xi Jinping wants to be seen as strong in protecting Chinese unity and preventing other countries from changing the status quo in their favor. Rather, he'd like to change the status quo in China's favor. But I don't think that that domestic factor is primary, and I would agree with Da Wei that Xi Jinping is currently in a very strong position. And my guess is that in the run-up to the next party Congress in the fall of 2022, that he will want to remain in a strong position.
Thank you very much. Major General Amidro, we have a question for you. It's from Dale Aluf. Some in Israel have called on the government to develop a strategy for engaging China. Do you agree with these voices? And if so, what would be the 3 most important considerations for such a strategy?
Israel has a very clear strategy towards China. It's not something that we have to innovate now. When the Prime Minister went to China in 2012, it was clear what we want to achieve. We want to have better relations with China. China is very important economically for Israel, and we hope that that will change slowly, even the political relations between Israel and China. This is one of our problems, that it was not changed at all. China didn't change even 1 centimeter in its policy towards Israel when it is coming to the international arena. We hope that that was the first and the second elements. The third one was that for us it was very important that China will understand the concerns of Israel relating to threats towards Israel, mainly Iran, but not only Iran. And in some cases we succeeded. I think that it was a great achievement that the Chinese kept their position within the P5+1, they didn't negotiate with the Iranians, and at the end, the failure of the negotiations was because of the American failure, not a Chinese one, but the Chinese were inside the group and didn't make any threat to leave it if during the sanctions time. They even kept most of the sanctions, not all of them, but most of the sanctions. And I think that was very important for us. It was very important for the negotiators, which didn't exploit it, but that was the issue. So we have a strategy. We want very good relations as possible relating to our economy relations. We have that gradually China will change its attitude towards the Jewish state and will not vote automatically everywhere in every occasion against Israel. And we want that the Chinese will understand the threat that Israel is facing, and from time to time will be even ready to prevent or to help to prevent such threats from being implemented by our enemies. Something that China was not so good in the past. China contributed to the Iranian nuclear capabilities by providing Iran with the yellow cake technology, which the Iranians didn't have. And we hope that in the future they will be more sensitive to those issues, because we are working very hard that China will understand the threat to Israel coming from this area. So these are the three elements of the strategy, and I don't think that we should innovate something new.
Thank you very much. Okay, so far it's all been very nice. I'm now going to ask the difficult questions. There are many areas of tension in the relationship between China and the US. We could talk about North Korea, India, South China Sea. I'm going to take a couple and ask Professor Glaser and Professor Dawe how they would see things progressing in certain scenarios. The first one is the economics and the politics of the World Trade Organization, and the economics and the politics of China's punishing Australia economically. Now, Professor Glaser, will a Biden administration provide a more robust, or seek to provide a more robust, unified response to such actions by China which seek to pick off American allies? And to Professor Dawe, there is a number of issues which China has serious tensions with the US. Most of those are in Asia, are in the Far East, whether we're talking about Taiwan or North Korea or the South China Sea. One of them is in the Middle East, and that's Iran. Because although American sanctions are very unilaterally very powerful, there is one country that does a lot of trade with Iran, which isn't the United States, and which could have an effect, and that is China, because China buys most of Iran's oil. So my question to you is, if the United States is willing to compromise on certain economic or political issues in Asia, is China willing to back down in its relationship with Iran? Okay, so Professor Glaser and then Professor Dawe.
So I'll be brief. I think that the first point I'd like to make is that as long as China is pressuring Australia economically, that will make it even more difficult for the United States to improve ties with China. So this is a factor that Beijing needs to understand, that it can't deal with individual countries that are allied with the United States and damage their interests and expect that the United States will ignore it. And I think particularly in the case of Australia, they just decided to file a case in the World Trade Organization. And this has only been done in the past by countries that were targets of China's economic coercion once, and that was Japan. And the EU and the United States did join that case, and China lost. So this case involves the barley tariffs that China put on Australian exports of barley. And it will, of course, will take years to work through the World Trade Organization, but my expectation is that China will also lose that case. But in the meantime, that's one example of something that I think the Biden administration will do to support Australia. And there is the potential for other actions to be taken. There's discussion about creating a reserve fund that some governments who are like-minded, as well as private companies, might contribute to help alleviate the negative impact of China's economic coercion. But the real question is about how we update the WTO and make it quite clear that these kinds of economic sanctions, if you will, and they're really not even necessarily sanctions because Beijing denies that it's really doing anything, that the WTO rules have to be made clearer. Those people I know who are trade lawyers tell me that indeed these actions by China already violate the spirit of WTO, if not the letter. But I think going forward, we have to make clearer that this is these kinds of actions are violations of the letter. So there will be, I think, an effort by the United States, along with many countries in the world, who want to see these actions end, because we have more now than a dozen countries that have been targeted by these economic coercive actions. Most of them are democracies, not all, even occasionally countries like Vietnam have been targeted. But I think that we have to update the WTO rules to ensure that this doesn't happen going forward.
Thank you very much. Professor Dawei?
Yes, okay. Thank you for this very interesting question. I think this is a hypothetical question that for this kind of exchange, first of all, I really don't think that could happen because those tensions you mentioned, no matter it's Taiwan, it's South China Sea, or some other tensions in this region, I think are critical, important for both China and the U.S. So I don't think it can be a bargain chip for Biden administration or for other U.S. administrations. Having said that, since it's a hypothetical question, so let's say if the U.S. one day say let's do a deal, probably I think China won't do this because I think on the Iran issue you mentioned, I think the purpose or the tension here is whether Iran can have the right to develop its nuclear technology, military or civil nuclear technology. China, of course, opposed any military nuclear technology of Iran. That's a reason why China joined the US and other partners for the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So the purpose is to stop Iran's military nuclear program rather than press Iran per se. I think if we have a deal or if we have a method to contain Iran's nuclear program, that will be fine. I think this is a goal. Exchange something in Far East with Iran it's not related to Iranian nuclear program. It's about a survival of the Iran regime or the country. I think this is not a goal of Chinese foreign policy. I mean, Iran is a country that have good relations with China. So I think of course they have their right to survive. They have their right to have their own regime. So I don't think China will exchange something, for Iran's survival or for Iran's regime security. I think this is not something we can exchange. And of course, back to the beginning, I don't think the US will do that. So the Biden administration, I think, will very likely to go back to the Iran nuclear deal. And we are very, very willing to see this, and we are very willing to cooperate with the Biden administration on the multilateral approach to contain the Iran's military nuclear program, while at the same time give them the legitimate civilian, civil nuclear right. I think this is what our policy is. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Major General Amidror, you asked in your comments that China be more sensitive to Israel's concerns on Iran and also to perhaps change its voting at the UN. Is Israel prepared to offer anything in exchange, since there are no free lunches in international relations? Or is the relationship with the US so ironclad as to mean that Israel will not diverge politically or strategically from the US, and therefore Israel has nothing political? It may have economic, but nothing political or strategic to offer China.
If you think that the Chinese administration is so cynical that for them everything is a question of give and take, you are right. But from what I learned about China, is something a little bit different, and I think that it is the interest of China to keep stability in the Middle East. And if Iran continues with each policy as it is today, to push its forces into Syria, to help the Houthis to fight in Yemen, to be involved in destructive way in Lebanon, it is contributing to destabilization of the Middle East. If the Iranians continue with their military goal relating to nuclear capability, and it is clear from the archive which had been brought by the Mossad from Tehran that was what they had in mind when everyone declared that there is a fatwa against it and no one is doing it and nothing is happening. We know for sure that they worked very hard to produce a whole project, and the immediate goal was 5 nuclear bombs. So it is clear where the Iranians want to be, and Israel is determined to stop it. And it's not the interest of China that Israel will bomb the Tehran and then the oil industry of Iran, because in a war between us and Iran, this is the target that we will have to act against. So I think that, leave alone low politics of give and take, I think it's the interest of China to enhance the stability in the Middle East, and Iran is clearly one of the most aggressive forces in the Middle East, destabilizing the area, specifically when it is coming to nuclear capability, but it is true about all its actions in the Middle East. It is not us who are sending missiles into the border of Iran. It is the Iranians who are sending missiles into the border of Israel. It is not us who are building proxies near Iran. It is the Iranians who are building proxy forces in Lebanon or in Syria, and so on and so forth. And at the end, the Chinese will have to decide, will they support the aggressive destabilized force in the Middle East called Iran, or they will be ready to help to put some constraints on the Iranians' massive aggressive policy. If not, it will lead to a war when we know where we are heading to, and the price will be paid by the international community, including those who are getting oil from the Middle East.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'd like to raise an issue for all three of you, each from your own angles, and that is this: that the United States is now more or less energy self-sufficient. It certainly doesn't need energy from the Middle East. And so those of us who follow this issue read that American policymakers or thinkers are thinking that America can be less engaged in the region and less engaged in the Gulf. And at the same time, we see China building naval bases or developing naval bases, whether it's in Djibouti or whether it's close to Pakistan or maybe in connection with Iran. So China, it seems to me, is trying to protect its energy security by becoming more engaged in the region. And America, it seems to me, might be considering becoming less engaged. And yet it seems to me that given US dominance in the Middle East is a very place for the US to apply pressure to China, which has relevance in the Far East. So my question to each of you is, how do you see your country's particular take on this? So if you're the United States, do you think the United States is going to play less of a role? Is China going to play more of a role? And how does Israel look at a potential less US role and more of a China role? Professor Glaser.
Well, I would start by saying that there are several factors that are driving the United States to pay somewhat less attention to the Middle East. Energy is one, but the recognition of the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific in general to US interests is also an important factor. That said, despite the pronouncement of the pivot to Asia almost 10 years ago, we still have not really disengaged from the Middle East, and I don't think we will, though there is obviously an effort to end what we call the forever wars and bring Americans home. And the Trump administration has made some progress, but I still think we will continue to have some forces in the Middle East. So I think perhaps the Middle East will get a bit less attention from the US, but even if there is an effort to really focus more in the Indo-Pacific, I still think that will be difficult to achieve. And if Russian and Chinese influence grows, then the United States will want to compete with that influence. And I'll comment very briefly on China, and that is that I think China's pursued a policy of wanting to have good relations with basically all countries that it engages with in the Middle East. And if it really is going to have a significant influence, it's going to have to start choosing sides. And I think that actually Beijing is reluctant to do that and really continues to allow Russia to be in the lead in the Middle East. So yes, it's more important to China for reasons of energy, but it still remains, I think, significantly behind some other regions in the world, of course, particularly the Indo-Pacific in China's overall priorities. But the Chinese want to benefit, I think, first and foremost commercially in the Middle East, and perhaps also over time politically. But I don't think they have any great near-term ambitions there. So we'll see if Professor Dawe agrees with me.
Unfortunately, we won't, because I've been informed that we've run out of time. So, gentlemen, my apologies, you won't have a chance to answer. I don't know whether it's apocryphal that America gets the last word, but we'll have to wait and see what happens in the next 4 years. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our three speakers for a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good night. My name is Tommy Steiner. I'm with Signal, and I want to thank, first of all, Jonathan Reinhold for handling the first session magnificently and for a wonderful discussion by the three speakers. And without further ado, we are moving on, with your permission, to the second session. This is Zoom style sessions where we have to be very punchy and very, but still in-depth and interesting. The second session wishes to introduce, to some extent, to the Israeli policy community a few new concepts like the Quad, the D10, the Indo-Pacific, which essentially are all sorts of terms related to US-led Western strategies to address the China challenge. the United States and its allies now increasingly refer to the Indo-Pacific as opposed to the Asia-Pacific. And now there's the Quad of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And even during the Trump administration, we've seen this beginning of multilateral frameworks, and President-elect Biden has been committed to pursuing this and even expanding this to what he has called the united front to take on or meet the challenge from China. Now, this could have also repercussions for Israel. But before we discuss Israel and delve into this issue, we have three great speakers from different corners of the world, and I want to thank, in particular, two of them for joining us at a very, very late hour, who can give us a very interesting perspective on the Western-led strategies to deal with China. First of all, from the United States, we have Dr. Kenneth Weinstein, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hudson Institute. We have also with us Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, who is the Chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore and a former Permanent Secretary of the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Last but not least, we have Professor Michito Tsuruoka from the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. He comes with experience working for the Ministry of Defense and for the Foreign Service. So, gentlemen, without much ado, let me start with a quick lead question, and let's try to keep our answers to the point. Will these strategies, be them the assembly of 10 great democracies, or the Quad, or the Indo-Pacific strategic framework, are these strategies there to effectively deal with the China challenge? Will the West, indeed form a united front and act together and can it really rise to the challenge? Dr. Weinstein, we will start with you.
First, Tommy, thank you for having me. Honored to be on this panel. Let me note that my comments today are in my capacity as Hudson Institute President and CEO and not as U.S. Ambassador Designate to Japan. And this is the first panel I'm doing, and it's because I think so highly of you, Tommy, that I agreed to do this panel. I think that one has to really understand the incredible strategic evolution that's occurred in the United States, but not simply in the United States with regard to China and the challenge that China poses. It's an evolution that's occurred obviously in Japan. It's where the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy was first conceived, and then Donald Trump borrowed Shinzo Abe's term, and there's been a strategic convergence between the United States and Japan, with the United States focusing first on defense and security, and then later on the need to promote international development, particularly in Southeast Asia as a critical part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and also in Africa now. And there's been this strategic convergence, but also in Australia, which now takes the challenge much more seriously than it did in its first days as members of the Quad, when it eventually backed out of potential military exercises about a decade ago. And then, but also in India, which is after the situation in Daklan, but even before that, we've seen this incredible strategic convergence. It's not just in the West, it's in Asia as well. And the notion that moving from the Pacific Command, which we had, to the Indo-Pacific Command shows the kind of totality of the challenge spanning from all the way from Northeast Asia to India, and including significant parts of Africa as well. So this is a broad effort. It's a bold effort. It's a multilateral effort, and it will absolutely continue and grow in importance in the coming years. And so in order to be quick, I'll yield to my colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinstein. Ambassador Kausikan, from your point of view in Singapore, is there really this convergence that Dr. Weinstein suggests?
Let me put it this way, Tommy. Terms like the Indo-Pacific or even the Quad, to my mind, are at present less a strategy than shorthand terms for a cluster of attitudes, or a cluster of anxieties, or a cluster of concerns about various aspects of Chinese behavior. They may crystallize into a strategy. We see some signs of that, but they are not yet there. I also kind of take issue a little bit with this idea that they are US-led. First of all, the Indo-Pacific was, in its initial stages at least, Japan-led. It was Shinzo Abe who first started this. But more fundamentally and paradoxically, the country that has done more to crystallize these attitudes into something that may become a strategy is not the US, it's not Japan, it's China. Because what they have in common is concerns about different aspects of Chinese behavior. Not everybody has the same concerns about the same aspects of Chinese behavior. Not everybody holds these concerns with the same degree of intensity, but I can't think of a single major country in this thing that we now call the Indo-Pacific that doesn't have some concerns. So the person you should credit for the coalescing of this group, vague though it may be, is Mr. Xi Jinping. The G10 is something a little different. It's even more amorphous. It seems to me something that has been tried before under the Clinton administration, under a different name, didn't work very well. Well, let's see what happens to it. Can't hear you, Tommy.
I was just saying, please continue. Sorry for that.
No, I think I'll stop here and let somebody else continue and we can carry on later.
Fine, thank you very much. Professor Tsuruoka, so what is the view in Japan? Is this the way to deal with it? Is it convergence, or is it really a cluster of anxieties, as Ambassador Kelsikan puts it?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, we have seen a lot of convergence between Japan, United States, and Japan and Australia, and Japan and India in terms of dealing with challenges from China. So the Indo-Pacific is a new concept, and so this is of course this is about countering the rise of China, but at the same time, it's not just about countering China. It is also a concept to involve China in various economic and other activities in the region. So the Japan under the Prime Minister Abe, who resigned a few months ago, but now Prime Minister Suga is committed to continue what Abe did. So the free and open in the Pacific, that is Abe's concept, and that was very much shared by the Trump administration. So it is, of course, about China, but at the same time, it's much more than that. So the bad news is that China has become, I think China is becoming increasingly hostile to the very notion of the Indo-Pacific. So it's quite interesting that China's reaction to the idea of Indo-Pacific has evolved a lot. And at the same time, of course, the Japanese concept has also evolved, and the US concept has also evolved. So I think what is important in terms of thinking about the Indo-Pacific is that it's still a flexible and concept. So the various outside powers are also welcome. So it's now quite interesting that various European countries are also showing interest in getting more involved and engaged in the Indo-Pacific region. So France, Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands, EU. So there are various other actors as well. And Quad, in just a few words, there are some fears or opposition, particularly from China, that Quad is to be the NATO of Asia. But I don't think it's the case. I don't see any real prospect of of that be materialized anytime soon or in foreseeable future. And one of the reasons for that is that the being flexible is one of the most important elements and features of Quad. So the foreign ministers meeting have been taking place, and at the same time, the naval exercises have been taking place. But of course, we are open to other countries' participation in our the joint training, joint exercises, and also as for policy dialogues, yes, of course, we also welcome other countries. And some countries like the UK or France have also already expressed their interest in getting more involved in Quad activities. And in terms of thinking about institutionalizing Quad, I think one of the biggest sort of hurdles comes from India. And India's decision to withdraw from RCEP negotiations, a regional comprehensive economic partnership, that's a regional FTA, EPA framework. And India decided last year to withdraw from RCEP. And just, I think, months ago or so, the RCEP was signed without India being a member. So and that episode, of course, it's very much about economy, trade and economy. But at the same time, we need to pay attention to the sensitivities that Indians feel in terms of thinking about regional order building in frameworks. And finally, a few words on D10. It's a quite interesting idea. And as a track 1.5 framework, there has been, it's been there for some time, led by the Atlantic Council of the United States. But now Prime Minister Johnson of the UK has officially proposed the idea of inviting India, Australia, and South Korea, Republic of Korea, to next year's G7 meeting. So as guests, but so this is a sort of a taking shape. But also here, what is important is to make these frameworks flexible, because the appropriate membership or framework are very much depend on the topics we need to deal with. So we have a separate, different framework for technological cooperation on one hand, or on the other hand for military exercises. So we have different frameworks, and so maintaining flexibility, I think, is still very important. So that it's why we very much welcome Israel's involvement or other countries' involvement as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsuroka. So let me go back to the point of the Quad that all three of you mentioned. And let me go back to you, Dr. Weinstein, because if I understand correctly from Professor Tsuroka, the Japanese are actually calling to the idea of turning the Quad as a basis for an alliance or a NATO-like Asia version of NATO. So what's the purpose of this Quad? What could it do? All sorts of activities. Will that really make a difference vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, the notion that the Quad could possibly be turned into some kind of alliance was suggested by Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun during a recent visit to India, if I recall correctly. I think, admittedly, I think that the Deputy Secretary would admit that we're at an early phase in this conception here in the United States, certainly, but that this would be the hope over the long term. I think there's a recognition that the challenge we face from China is multifaceted, that it is much more complex than the challenge we faced from the Soviet Union as we began to think through the NATO alliance structure in the mid to late 1940s. It's a threat that is absolutely a military threat that is certainly growing in scope and size. It's an economic threat in the sense that China has attempted to build up what my colleague William Schneider here at Hudson Institute calls an infosphere. That's to say, a Chinese operating system of information that includes 5 heavily subsidized 5G systems run by state-owned enterprises, that includes attempts to dominate artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and to have all sorts of information pass through Beijing from around the world to give China access, including through massive cyber hacking that we've seen, and leveraging its ability to steal technologies, which it's done, which the FBI director, Christopher Wray, spoke about in a widely publicized speech this summer. So it's a much more complex threat. It's a much more fluid threat than the Soviet threat was, but it also occurs in a context in which there is incredible cooperation with China on economics and trade, whether it be with Japan, whether it be with India, whether it be with the United States, certainly with Singapore, and certainly with Israel. So I think that the notion that this is going to quickly escalate into or become an alliance, this is something over the long term to think about as we watch China's behavior and as we see the growth of China's armed forces, and we see the challenge that China is posing all the way from the first island chain and well beyond. So I think flexibility is the order of the day. But China has to understand that its actions will have consequences. And to the extent that China thinks that it could potentially Finlandize our allies and partners and make them accept things that fait accompli without a reaction from the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, those days are gone. And so I think we have to think about it in those terms. And also, as Professor Soroka noted, there's also there are different countries that we're going to have observer status with the Quad who have deep interest in taking part in Quad activities, but may not be full-time members of the Quad. So this is definitely a work in progress, but one that whose evolution will very much depend on not just on what China says, but what China actually does in the years to come.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Kaustikan, earlier you sounded a bit more, I don't want to use the term dismissive, but you had doubts about how the US and other Western countries are leading their efforts vis-a-vis China. So let me ask you a very simple question. If you had to advise President-elect Biden and give him 2-3 policy recommendations of how to rise to the challenge of China effectively, what would be those 3 items, 3 quick bullet items?
Okay, before I get to that, can I just make one point to reinforce what Dr. Weinstein just said?
Of course.
I don't think the Quad will ever be an Asian NATO for a very simple reason. What Dr. Weinstein said, I think, if I may put it more starkly, I use the term anxieties, I use the term concerns to talk about China. Because even those countries in the Indo-Pacific that have territorial disputes with China, even those that have been victims of China cyber threats, do not consider China purely as a threat. Everybody is interdependent with China, and yet that interdependence coexists with deep strategic mistrust. It's only a degree of mistrust. What's the degree of mistrust? Nobody is without mistrust, but nobody considers China an enemy or an adversary in the straightforward way that the Soviet Union was considered by many of us as on the other side. It's a much more complex situation. So the Quad, the RCEP, the CPTPP, and others, they are part of multiple overlapping frameworks that will eventually, I think, define the regional order. Now, to your specific question about what advice I will give Mr. Biden, were he foolish enough to listen to me, right? My first piece of advice is not enough just not being Trump. Not everything Mr. Trump did was bad. Not everything the Obama administration did before Trump was good. Second, is, yes, America suffered an erosion of what has come to be called soft power under Mr. Trump, but most of the issues in the Indo-Pacific issues are at their foundation hard power issues. Don't forget that. And third, in this region, trade is strategy. And that's the huge missing piece of American policy since the end of the Obama administration.
Well, I have to say that that was to the point. Professor Toroka, everybody here seems to agree that that Quad turn into a NATO is not very likely. Now, you have served in Brussels. You have worked closely with NATO. Now, NATO actually is starting to consider what it could do vis-a-vis China. Does NATO really have a role? Could this be the base for the Western response to the China challenge?
Thank you very much. I don't see a direct military role for NATO in Asia, but some NATO countries are already involved, and some countries will be involved more in the region, in addition to the United States. So the UK and France, from time to time, have their ships in the region, so they are very much engaged. And but as for NATO per se, I think I think it's really a great idea for NATO to discuss more about China and Asian issues. So it could be used as a sort of venue to discuss Asian strategic issues mainly among Europeans, in addition, of course, to the United States and Canada. So as an early warning forum or early warning venue to discuss various things that could affect NATO's interest in security. I think in that sense, it's really great for them to talk more about China and Asian issues, but not direct military role.
Thank you for that. Dr. Weinstein, one of our participants and good friends of Signal, Gordon Werke from Germany, has already raised the issue also of the Summit of Democracies that President President-elect Biden has suggested and said that he will convene in 2021. There seems to be that a turn to value-based approach vis-a-vis China and bringing together the allies. Is this the way to go ahead? Will this have an added value, if you wish?
Look, I think we've already seen a start of a real convergence on these value-based issues certainly in the West, and where particular China's horrific treatment of the Uyghurs, China's crackdown in Hong Kong. These issues have risen to the top of the human rights agenda for many countries, including a number of countries who normally are not that outspoken on China's human rights issues. I mentioned Germany in particular, where there have been differences over 5G policy and differences over other attitudes with regard to China. So I think that continuing the focus on human rights that the Trump administration has really brought to the fore, the continuing of the sanctions on leaders involved in the horrific human rights violations, whether in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and beyond, that this really does lay the groundwork for a broader effort in the West on these issues. I think other countries have so far been a little bit more reticent to speak directly about some of these challenges, though they do raise the human rights issues. So this is, but speaking about the China challenge in terms of human rights gives it a resonance that cuts across both left and right sides of the political spectrum. So I think it is an area that's quite fruitful in an area I think that the Biden administration is likely to bring great focus upon.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Kausikan, do you believe that people or governments, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, are impressed or are willing to embrace this value-based turn, this talk about democracies? Let me ask it in other words. Would Singapore wish to participate in a D10 or 11 or 12 format?
Let me say this. First of all, democracy is a protean term. There are many different types of democracies. There's not only one definition. I could make much the same point about human rights. Human rights are universal at such a high level of generality, it says very little practical for how societies actually organize themselves. These are general points. Now, if the Biden administration is going to take such an approach as a means of distinguishing itself from its predecessor administration, fine. Every administration tries, even when it's quite the same, to distinguish itself from its predecessor. If this is the way it chooses, people will understand that. But you push it further, you are going to lose a lot of support. Don't forget that not everybody is equally enamored of Western values or American values. The shining city upon a hill has always cast a rather dark shadow, but this is a reality much more evident to those of us who live below the hill rather than those who live on the hill. So I think you have to be very careful and very nuanced in implementing such an approach. I don't even think all American allies in the Indo-Pacific will buy into every aspect of that approach. So be careful about it.
Thank you for that. Professor Tsuroka, do you agree with Ambassador Kausikan, or do you actually think that the moral imperative is an important glue for dealing with the challenge called China?
Yes, of course, there are various definitions of democracy or various definitions of human rights. So it's just the fact and the reality. So whether you like it or not, so that's the reality. And the Summit of Democracies, yes, I think there is a fairly strong support for that idea in Japan. And but from my point of view, what is more important is whether we are democracies or not. But what is more important is the substance. So what we want to achieve in which frameworks. So it seems that there are now various kinds of frameworks and the kinds of summit ideas. So G7 is there. And the UK presidency, next year, the UK presidency has already proposed to invite 3 countries. So that would make it a sort of D10 already. So we don't know whether there's going to be a clear distinction between D10 and the Biden's idea of Summit of Democracies. So we need to figure out various these things first. But democracies, and that's I think a sort of trend, and we can live with that, of course.
It's a trend, and we can live with that. That are interesting point. I want to turn now both Dr. Weiser and to Ambassador Kausikan, because both of you also have an interesting perspective, I guess, on Israeli foreign policy and how Israel stands towards the world. And ask you, Israel is considered one of the main allies of the United States. With this apparent value-based turn, and with this expectation of the next administration, but actually also of the current one, that allies will coalesce and join the US effort or the Western effort to meet the China issue, Where does this leave Israel? Does this offer an opportunity for Israel, or could it actually become also the broader value-based approach more of a strategic headache for Israel? Dr. Weinstein.
My sense is this should provide an opportunity for Israel. Look, we've seen in the last couple of years a rare spectacle where the United States and both its national security advisor at the time, John Bolton, and also Secretary of State Pompeo in his interactions with Israeli officials, where it's been in the press, they warned behind closed doors about economic engagement with China, the challenges posed by China's management of the Haifa container port, the rail system down in Ashdod and the like. Deep concern about Israel's high-tech sector becoming both funded by and partnered with Chinese firms with potential ties, with ties in some cases to state-owned industries that could cooperating with various state security sectors. And so those issues have come to the fore, and we've seen changes now in some Israeli policies and the beginning of a CFIUS policy in Israel that's certainly welcomed, and China's exclusion from Israel's 5G systems from the initial tender, which is certainly welcomed here in the United States. And so the question is now, what is the next stage? And cooperation and partnership on these human rights issues would certainly be welcome from an American perspective, and I think would also bode well for Israel's desire to present itself as the sole democracy in the Middle East, and one that has a moral standing worth noting.
All right. Ambassador Kelsey Khan, do you think that Israel's always had this practical, pragmatic, realist approach, rather reluctant to talk about norms and values, apart from citing on occasion that we are the only democracy in the Middle East? Well, how should Israel, in your perspective, respond? Should Israel be interested in joining the D10, for instance?
Look, Tommy, I spent the last 5 or 6 years nagging Israel that you're heading for trouble with China because you only looked at China through an economic lens for far too long, right? When most Israelis looked at China, they saw only dollars and cents. And naivete and Israeli are not two words are normally used in the same sentence, but vis-a-vis China, I used to use it all the time, all right? Now you have woken up, all right? But rather than take a values-based approach, I would take an interest-based approach. Singapore and Israel is in very much a very similar position. I won't say exactly the same position, similar position. In that, in the end, it will come to this. If we are not careful, one day somebody from the US will come to us and say, you want the F-35? Do this or don't do this. Now, I think you should preserve strategic autonomy to the extent you can. And the way you do this is to take an interest-based approach. Some interests will take you in the direction of the United States. And I think what interests those are quite obvious. But will all interests take you in that direction? Do you need to neatly align all your interests in every domain in one neat direction? I don't think so, because you can't ignore China. Singapore can't ignore China. Nobody can ignore China. So sometimes you may lean in the direction of the United States in some domains. Sometimes you may lean in the direction of China in some domains. And sometimes, to put it bluntly, you may have to piss off both to go your own way because your interests take you that way. It's better to take an interest-based approach than a values-based approach, because a values-based approach can impose an artificial neatness on what is really a very messy and complex situation.
Well, I have to admit, I wasn't all that surprised by your answer. We're starting now to move towards wrapping things up. And one of the questions we have received from the audience is from a student in Israel, Ksenia Rudenko. And Ksenia was asking about the most possible scenario for the East Asian region. Will it be a multipolar region with 3, 4, 5 leading countries? I assume that she's referring to Japan, China, and India, with the United States, of course. Or will it fall under a Chinese order and control? And she even raises a third possibility that maybe they will follow all an ASEAN path and increase their integration without a leader. But essentially, what she's asking, I will want to add, looking ahead 10 years from now, and this, considering we have now the Biden administration, President Xi in position, in 2030, are we reaching closer or to a Thucydides trap, to an all-out conflict between China and the United States? Or do you see any other possible scenario emerging? Let's start, Professor Tsuroka, with you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. The one of the things that I can say is that we don't want to see a China-dominated or China-centered hierarchical regional order in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. So that we need to maintain what we call a rules-based international order. So of course, the US, we expect to remain a huge actor in the region, along with China and of course Japan and ASEAN. Yes, the weight of ASEAN is set to increase as well. So and of course India is there as well. So the term multipolarity, I think, has a certain connotation. So I don't want to use that term, but what we are going to see, or what we would like to see, is a continuation and maintenance of a rules-based international order where the United States, Japan, ASEAN, and India, and other countries play a big role to prevent China-dominated hierarchical regional order. Thank you.
Thank you for that. To Weinstein, your perspectives, is the United States going to win this challenge, or will it just simply leave Asia to the Chinese?
I think we've seen an absolute sea change here in U.S. policy, beginning with Vice President Pence's historic speech on China a couple of years back, which has really marked the notion that the United States spent decades trying to assure China's rise, and the belief that China would, as we all know, be transformed into a more prosperous and therefore a more democratic and open society, peacefully coexisting with its neighbors. We now see that the peaceful coexistence with the neighbors and prosperity do not inherently go together. And we have now embarked on a new and a much more realistic approach to U.S. foreign policy in Asia, working with our allies where we can to send subtle signals to the Chinese, and sometimes not so subtle ones, about, and it's a variegated strategy with different allies and different partners playing different roles, that we are no longer going to sit back and allow China to continue the policies that had predated the current administration. So I am far more optimistic that both the American public and elites, certainly the Japanese elites who have been well attuned to this challenge ahead of US elites, and other elites in the region are engaged, realize this is the primary policy challenge that we face, that we face numerous challenges, and that as a result, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we will be much better placed to defend freedom and prosperity in Asia, and to prevent Asia from falling under Chinese hegemony, but it's a long-term strategy, and which takes a daily effort around the globe from our allies and partners to make sure that this is the case. But I'm optimistic now for the first time in quite some time.
Well, both previous speakers were optimistic and confident, or more or less confident that actually the United States and West will rise to the challenge. Ambassador Carice Witte, in the heart of Asia, what do you think? What is your assessment?
I think towards the end of the Hu Jintao era, China made a strategic mistake. A strategic mistake which Mr. Xi Jinping has doubled down on. And that strategic mistake is to, in effect, abandon Deng Xiaoping's wise policy of hiding your capabilities and biding your time. I call it a strategic mistake because it's irreversible. Once you reveal your capabilities, once you reveal your ambitions, people are not going to forget. Nobody is going to shun China, but you can see the pushback from countries big and small already beginning. Professor Soroka doesn't like the word multipolarity, and I understand why, but I'll use it anyway. The Indo-Pacific is a naturally multipolar region. Why is Japan, Japan? Why is Korea, Korea? Both are, Japan is Japan and Korea is Korea, and Vietnam is Vietnam because many centuries ago, they essentially decided to reject the Chinese world order. That is an essential part of their national identity. India is a large, huge, as ancient a country as China. It's never going to subordinate itself to any other country, not the United States and certainly not China. And Indonesia is not an inconsiderable country either. So China's ambitions are unrealizable, particularly since it made that strategic mistake towards the end of the Hu Jintao era.
Okay, so I'm trying, but Ambassador Carice Witte, in one sentence now, you think that the United States and the West cannot actually meet the challenge posed by China?
I didn't say that. I think the West...
I know, but I'm trying to...
China's rise is a geopolitical fact. The rise of a country as large as China must, by definition, mean a relative adjustment in the distribution of power. But it's only a relative adjustment. It's not an absolute adjustment. The US is there. I could not understand during the Trump administration why there were people saying over and over again the US was in retreat. How could the US be in retreat if it was determined by word and deed to robustly compete with China? You could argue about the methods of competition, but the intention was clear. It's there. It's not going to disappear. Japan is not going to disappear. India is not going to disappear. Korea is not going to disappear. Australia, not. Indonesia, not. And certainly even Singapore, we don't intend to disappear. So I don't think we should exaggerate China. China is neither some, super cunning Fu Manchu-like entity, nor is it an invincible juggernaut. It's a country like any other, a big one. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. And I think we need to have a balanced view of China, because the strategic competition is not just a material competition, it's also a psychological competition. And we should not talk ourselves into a fatalistic frame of mind. Fatalism is fatal.
So, Dr. Weinstein, what do you think of Ambassador Carice Witte's very realistic perspective? But actually, it plays down the threat that China poses. Maybe we are overdoing it. In one sentence, please.
Look, I would agree. We have now called out the threat and made it visible. We've certainly been aided, as Professor Carice said, by Xi Jinping, and has made our task certainly to unify and convince others that much easier. And I fully agree that the Trump administration has done extraordinary things in bringing the threat public and working with our allies and partners to make significant progress in this area, clearly.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for this very insightful discussion, which touched on the Indo-Pacific and even on Israel, a wide-ranging discussion. Very fascinating. Thank you for joining us, especially from Asia at this very late hour. And without further ado, let me please hand back the reins to Signal's Executive Director, Carice Witte, so that she can introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy, and a really warm thanks to all of our speakers. What an outstanding set of sessions. Following these two discussions, dealing with the evolving US-China rivalry and how it's been impacting Israel, the concluding address coming from the top US diplomat dealing with the Middle East could not be more fitting. We are honored and privileged to have the US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, the Honorable David Shankar, giving the concluding address for this first day of our conference, and we are deeply grateful to him for making the time to join us today. Before yielding the floor to him, I wish to point out that Assistant Secretary Shankar has accumulated more than 2 decades of expertise on the Middle East and US policy in the region. We are therefore extremely grateful and looking forward to his insights, both on US relations and policy in the Middle East and with Israel in the context of the great power competition between US and China. Assistant Secretary Shankar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Carice. It's a pleasure to join Signal today to speak about how the U.S. views the People's Republic of China and their engagement in the Middle East, and specifically China's ties with Israel. Let me start by stressing what I hope you and everyone around the world already knows. The United States has ironclad commitment to Israel's national security. Israel is an invaluable partner to the U.S., confronting threats to the United States and Israeli national security around the world. And so I'll share with you today that our bilateral conversation about threats to national security really, we believe, must now include a discussion about the PRC's activities. So I want to stress 2 points. First, we understand that countries around the region have and will continue to have important relationships with China. I'm not here to tell Israel to stop engaging or trading with China. But what I want to do is to have, for Israel to have no illusions about the serious risk in doing business with China and its companies. The PRC's continued subversion of international norms requires a sharp and collective response. We don't wish to disengage from the Chinese people, and neither should you. We welcome cooperation where our interests align, for example, resolving trade inequities, achieving denuclearization in North Korea, promoting an end to the conflict in Afghanistan, and stemming the flow of fentanyl into the United States. But we want to ensure that the PRC's influence and activities in the Middle East do not come at the expense of the region's prosperity, stability, fiscal viability, or long-standing relationships with the United States. And second, I want to stress that this evolution of US policy will endure. Our shift towards strategic competition is in direct response to the PRC's actions over the last 2 decades. The world welcomed the PRC joining the international order in a collegial manner, and the rise of China was largely a result of open markets in the United States and Europe. Unfortunately, China chose a mercantilist, militaristic path in response to this opening. Instead of choosing economic liberalization and embracing open competition, the Chinese Communist Party uses political suppression, economic coercion, and the manipulation of the international rules-based order to support their authoritarian governance and assistance model. Expanding on my first point, we have a number of concerns about China's growing influence in the Middle East. While we welcome the transparent and aid to help alleviate the suffering caused by the pandemic, we need to understand the PRC's initial response to the outbreak to prepare the next pandemic threat. Beijing delayed sharing full information about the virus, and doctors, scientists, and investigative reporters face consequences for their efforts to combat the outbreak in Wuhan and alert the world to the dangers of the spreading virus. The PRC's actions and lack of transparency allowed the virus to spread globally during this critical period. The disinformation about the virus encouraged by the PRC officials undermined the global effort to combat the virus. Beijing then engaged in an aggressive propaganda campaign to deflect blame and reshape the global narrative around COVID-19. The continual swirl of disinformation is part of a broader effort to promote pro-Beijing narratives that present China as superior in the COVID-19 response, and the West is failing to protect its people and provide aid to the global community. We're also concerned with the PRC's development and investment activities, including the use of opaque and predatory lending, condoning and participating in corrupt practices, and promoting commercially non-viable projects. The PRC seeks to structure deals that leave it with the advantage and put our partners' economies at risk, particularly deals from which Beijing gains access or even control of critical infrastructure, data, or technology. We have seen the PRC pursue acquisition and investment in strategic infrastructure across Israel. This is a national security threat for many countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. Simply put, investments by China risk undermining the national security of countries where they invest. Earlier this year, while visiting Israel, I joined Secretary Pompeo in pressing the Israeli government to take a closer look at the implications of PRC investment in critical infrastructure. The United States views close cooperation with Israel on critical infrastructure and foreign direct investment risk management as an invaluable component to our joint security and intelligence partnership. We believe any investment should take place within the confines of strong regulatory structures that ensure companies investing in Israel do so in a manner that does not undermine Israeli national security. While Israel's investment revenue review mechanism, is a step in the right direction, we certainly would like to see more, especially in the field of high tech. We are committed to working with Israel to strengthen this new mechanism, as well as to developing other ways to protect Israeli technology. The United States will continue to share with Israel lessons that we have learned in developing our own foreign investment screening system, and will offer technical assistance as Israel's new oversight committee develops to meet the needs of Israel's unique operating environment. Israel's vibrant high-tech sector is a juicy target for the PRC. We're concerned about PRC-backed investments that attempt to acquire emerging, sensitive, and foundational technologies that often have dual-use applications, and thus could put both our partners and our national security at risk. Investments in critical infrastructure like 5G telecom are also worrying, given the ability of PRC to coerce such firms to cooperate with their intelligence services without any meaningful checks and balances on these authorities. The PRC's practice of using AI algorithms and big data for what is euphemistically referred to as predictive policing. Their use of advanced surveillance technology used to be stuff of science fiction movies, but it is unfortunately the reality in China and could be the reality in many other countries as they seek to export these Orwellian practices. We want to ensure governments in the region and across the world do not embrace Beijing's techno-authoritarian methods of social control. Unbridled authoritarianism puts all of our security at greater risk. We're also deeply concerned about Beijing's human rights abuses. The PRC's actions to repress members of ethnic and religious minority groups, including the mass internment of more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims, ethnic Kazakhs, and others, are abhorrent. It's unconscionable for the states in this region to let this pass without comment, let alone sign on to statements praising PRC's actions. And we're concerned with the PRC's backed firms' oil purchases, providing an economic lifeline to Tehran. These embolden and support Tehran's efforts to sow discord, terrorism across the region, we should remind ourselves that China's long-term economic engagement with and investment in Iran undermines our joint efforts to pressure Iran to change its malign behavior. It's no secret that the Iranian regime is working hard to conclude a 25-year strategic partnership with China, in which Chinese investments and purchases from Iran, especially of oil, could total as much as $400 billion over that time span, all going to the coffers of a regime bent on Israel's destruction. We also want countries in the region to hold Chinese government to account as it tries to play both sides in regional conflicts. As a responsible global leader, we use our influence to encourage countries to respect their international obligations and commitments, uphold the basic tenets of regional security and stability, and maintain the rule-based international order. Beijing does not. Currently, the PRC free rides on the security we provide for the region. It partners with Iran while at the same time trying to be a partner for our mutual friends in the Gulf. Beijing can't have it both ways. Ultimately, the security of half of China's oil imports depends on restraining Iran's malign regional behavior and threats to disrupt global shipping, especially in the Gulf. These trends will shape regional security for decades to come. Regardless of the composition of future governments in either of our countries, the PRC will continue to seek to expand its regional and international influence. As I noted at the outset, the US commitment to Israel's security is unwavering. That commitment has been on display over the past months as we've adopted the Abraham Accords, facilitating Israel's broader engagement and integration into the neighborhood. We cooperate on defense, intelligence, on diplomacy across international organizations. So I invite you to ask yourselves, do you think the PRC will ever have the inclination or the leverage to sway partners and provide the necessary assurances to facilitate a game-changing policy initiative like the Abraham Accords, or protect Israel when it's threatened? Over the long term, part of our stability, our ability to work together and ensure Israel's security depends on an effective international order that respects international institutions and international obligations. Despite occasional issues, Israel by and large benefits from this order, particularly the economic system that encourages robust trade, not only between the United States and Israel, but between Israel and Europe and all the other major trading partners. That's why we want to ensure that the PRC does not corrupt this order to all of our detriment. I applaud what Signal is doing today, working to develop a clear understanding of the future of the US-Israel-China relationship. And I encourage you to proceed with no illusions about the challenges and opportunities in Israel's relationship with China. So thank you for allowing me to be with you today. It's a real pleasure.
Assistant Secretary Shankar, thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate your insights. Definitely, it is clear that there's a lot of work to be done in these relationships. From what we heard today, from the different speakers during the two sessions, and from you, there are both understandings, misunderstandings, and a lot of new things that we're all going to have to work on. So for all of you who have stuck with us for this entire conference today, thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the moderators. Our deep thanks to David Schenker, and I want to invite everybody to join us tomorrow. You can, if you don't have the link already, you can reach out to Evelyn at sino-israel.org, and she will send you the link for tomorrow. We're starting at 10 a.m. Israel time. It'll be hard for the Americans to join us, but we will be hopefully welcoming many Asians, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you Israelis and Europeans tomorrow. And thank you again. Shalom.